Welcome to The Third Story. I'm your host, Leo Sidran, and this is the last episode of 2019. Probably. And what a year it's been here. So many great conversations, so many great guests. Today's guest is no exception. He's the legendary recording engineer and producer, Glyn Johns. If you don't know, Glyn has produced and or engineered with such artists as, get ready for this, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, The Who, the Eagles, Bob Dylan, Linda Ronstadt, Johnny Halliday, The Band, Eric Clapton, The Clash, Ryan Adams, The Steve Miller Band, Emmylou Harris, Midnight Oil, Joe Satriani, Joan Armatrading, Georgie Fame, and many others, including my dad, Ben Sidran. In fact, Glyn was in many ways responsible for my dad's first recording contract with Capitol Records in 1971, something that we do talk about at the end of this conversation. If you're a person who's involved in the process of recording or producing records, it's quite possible that at some point you've heard about his technique for recording drums, sometimes referred to as the Glyn Johns method. The sound of his recordings has had an immeasurable influence on the way we listen to popular music, particularly rock and roll, and especially British rock and roll. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2012, and he published a book about his life titled Sound Man in 2014. It's a great book. Glyn's career and discography are so extensive that it's difficult to summarize here. It's so much, and for much of the 60s and 70s, he was just non-stop working, flying back and forth between London and LA, setting up the mics and tearing them back down again, putting up the faders, aligning the machines, the whole thing. Sometimes you look at a person's career and contribution and you realize that part of it happens via talent and innovation, creativity, and some of it happens by simply putting in the work. And Glyn certainly innovated. He certainly had a gift, and he had talent, but he also really put in the work. I was so curious to talk to him about the extra musical aspects of running sessions. How important is one's personality, disposition, demeanor to running a recording session? Because my impression of Glyn has always been that he is unafraid to speak his mind, to say what he thinks is the right thing to do, and even to recuse himself from a situation over the years if he thought either he was not the right person for it or if the project was not the right fit for the person that he was. Here he talks about his philosophy of recording, producing, and managing a career in record making. I have curated a Spotify playlist of some of my favorite Glyn Johns recordings, and you can find that on the website third-story.com. While you're there, you know this, you can sign up, subscribe, say hello, check the archive, and even click the link to the Patreon page where you can support this project on a deeper level. If you like this sort of thing, you may also enjoy previous episodes with other recording engineers and producers with whom I've talked over the years, including the legendary Al Schmidt, Butch Vig, James Farber, Ryan Hewitt, Larry Klein, John Leventhal. Whoa, that's a pretty good list already, and that's not even all of it. Third-story.com. Also, are you a modern person? Do you listen to podcasts on a podcast app on your phone? If not, you should consider doing that. And if so, you should consider subscribing to this podcast via your app of choice and then rating and reviewing it. So here I am on a foggy, slightly rainy late afternoon in November, walking into Glyn Johns' house in London, drinking tea and starting to chat. Glyn knows that part of my career is spent making music for advertising. So we start out by talking about that world, advertising people, advertising agencies, and his experience of working in that universe.
It's a bloody good way to earn a living, and different and challenging.
Then the conversation just starts to roll. Listen in on my conversation with the great Glyn Johns.
A day and a half a week of jingles.
Yes.
Mostly one client, a guy called Johnny Johnson, who was the jingle king in those days, in the 50s, late 50s. So it would be a jingle every hour.
Right.
And then the next client would come and so on. Different musicians, whatever. And that was my introduction to agency people. Sort of mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. How the fuck they ever got the job
Would you place this how you think it's right? I don't pretend to know how to tell you where to place any microphone, not even a lavalier microphone.
Very funny. Okay.
Well, like everything else, I think if you saw a certain kind of person in 1964, it's only more so now, you know.
1959.
Oh my
I'm
God.
talking about, yeah. Now, I'm sure they're even worse now. I don't know. I don't think they could be any worse, actually. But basically, they're people completely out of their depth. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And they interfere, or they feel they have to say something, and it's usually rubbish. And it's usually, they have a very firm opinion, and then they argue with each other. I did a session with Boz Scaggs in San Francisco. I was making an album, and he said to me one day, look, I've been asked to do an Annie Greensprings wine commercial. Can we take the morning of some morning off and would you do it for me? And I went, yeah, sure, it's fine. The control room fills up with, I don't know how many people, I can't remember, doesn't matter. And I was terribly polite and, you know, asked them all to sit down and be quiet, whatever. So we start trying to cut, they're all chatting. So I turned the monitors down and I said, please, would you mind, I'm trying to work. If you want to talk, there's a lounge next door. They all apologised, just carried on working. All start talking and more people come. So I'm trying, I can't get on with the session. So I got so pissed off. I turned the monitors down and I left. I just got in, went out, got my car, drove back to the hotel.
And what do you think, an assistant finished it? Who knows?
No, I have no idea what happened. I can't remember. I should know. I mean, I probably did at the time. But I couldn't deal with it anymore. It all came flooding back from when I was a kid, you know. And no, they just were so rude, they wouldn't listen. So, whether they learned to listen or not, I don't know.
I don't know. I don't think.
I doubt that that's true.
But you know, it does speak to something that I've heard about you, and that I think you even have spoken to in your book. You talk about it, that if a situation is not really right for you, you are not afraid to leave it. I mean, over the years, there have been projects or times when you've said, you know what?
Yeah, I'm wasting my time, yeah.
How do you know when that's happening? What has to happen for you to say, you know what, this is a waste of my time?
Well, I don't... It has to be a situation where clearly there isn't going to be an end result, or an end result that's in any way satisfactory to either me or the artist I'm trying to work with. Simple as that. And that has happened infrequently. You just draw the line, really. I mean, the most infamous one is the Jimi Hendrix at the Albert Hall, where I asked him if he'd consider
turning down.
Using a smaller amp. Actually, he can still keep it loud.
Yeah.
But I said, if you use this rig in here now, the audience aren't going to hear a note you play, and frankly, neither am I. You know, it's just going to be a complete waste of time. And he was very polite and everything else. And this is the sound check. Of course, he didn't change anything. So the show started, and I realised he hadn't changed anything, and it just sounded the most absurd noise you've ever heard in your life. So I went home.
Because, as you say, no result. There's no results here.
No, well, there was no. It wasn't going to. I was just going to sit there all night, wasting my time. And I'd only just flown in from America. I was tired. I was very tired, and I just thought, I don't need this. I really don't need this. I don't even know why I did the session, really. In the first place, I was never a big Hendrix fan. I did it as a favour, I suppose. I can't remember. Doesn't matter anyway. So that was it. I mean, my assistant changed reels and, you know, and did a playback afterwards, and they wondered where the hell I was. It was quite funny, actually.
You say you just flown in. I look at your output from 67 to 77. I mean, I wish they had airline miles back then. It's a shame they didn't have those back then.
Yes, absolutely. I'd still be using them now.
It just seems like every other week you were on a flight.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. Yeah, I did travel a lot. The backwards and forwards like a bloody yo-yo.
Did you like it?
I loved the contrast of the two countries enormously, and I loved the contrast of working with Americans as against British people. And I don't just mean because of their nationality, I mean because of the music. the influences were more extreme in one case or another. Coupled with that, American recording studios were slightly different from what I was used to in the UK, so I was learning a lot about another way of working technically to a small degree. So it was quite interesting.
How would you characterize, in broad strokes, at least when you first got to California, the difference between working in England and working in LA?
Well, the biggest difference, funnily enough, and I think your dad may well have been on the session, was the union. All sessions were union in those days.
Uh-huh.
And they would send representatives of the union to the sessions and check out if you were behaving or not. If the people there were union members, 1, 2, and if they were, had they reported the session? I'd never experienced that in the UK. There was a union in the UK, but everybody who recorded didn't have to be in it. You know? If you booked musicians and orchestra or whatever, they were all union. I mean, that all went through the union.
Right.
It was completely legit. But as a producer or as an engineer, you didn't have to report to the union in any shape, way, or form. So that was probably the biggest difference. I don't know, the whole experience is different. It's just, Los Angeles is not London.
Yes. Well, you say something in your book that I think is so crucial in general, which is like, when you started out, the whole infrastructure of the way records got made was very stratified, right? You had songwriters, you had engineers, you had singers. The records were made in 3-hour sessions, and there was no working on the weekend. Everything was sort of quite orderly.
Very much so, yeah.
And by the time you end up in California in the end of the 60s, it's like, you're working 3 months on a record all night long. There are drugs, it's really changed.
Yes.
I don't know if that's a question about the 60s or LA or both, but it seemed like it really had changed.
Well, it changed in the UK as well. I mean, the self-contained artist who wrote their own material, bands in particular, once the guys who were in charge of the industry at the time didn't really understand what was going on with us lot at all. They had not a clue. And the brighter ones shut up and let us get on with it, facilitated by paying for what we were doing, and stayed out of the way. So it did go from everything being done in 3-hour increments, and you were expected to do 4 songs in those 3 hours, and the artist sang someone else's song, to all of a sudden there were people writing their own songs and performing them and wanting to experiment more with sound. And in some cases, they were still figuring out how to play, I guess. I don't know. But there was a lot of... that you wouldn't go... Obviously, you wouldn't necessarily go in with something rehearsed. The Rolling Stones in particular would write in the studio. For example, they were one of the first bands that I ever worked with that actually created stuff actually in the room rather than bringing it rehearsed. And that took a lot more time, and before you knew where you were taking 6 weeks to make an album rather than 2-3 days, or 2 days. Or in a day in the old days. So that was going on in the UK in parallel with what was going on in America. In fact, we might have even preceded the whole changing the whole system, along with the fact that engineers worked for a studio for one place, were employed by that studio, and the studio was equipped with equipment that they invariably built themselves, which gave each studio not only its own acoustics that identified it, but also the equipment in it. The combination of the two was what made a studio successful or not. And now that is dissipated enormously because there are a few companies that manufacture the equipment from which studios purchase, and they don't really have their own sound. They're purchasing someone else's, basically. And the only difference is, of course, the acoustics in the room.
Right, and as you say, the engineer was a staff employee of the studio.
Yes.
The producer also was a staff employee of the label.
The producer was an A&R man. I've never understood why we were called producers. I don't know who came up with that. I'd love to find him and poke him in the eye, because it's actually it's nonsense. It's the normal sense that we all know as a producer is everybody knows what a film producer is, the person who raises the money.
Yes.
In some cases, provide it. And then their role isn't creative at all, other than perhaps they will obviously have a say in who directs it and they might even have a say in who the actors are. Mm-hmm. But the director takes that creative role. So really, I've always considered us, record producers, really we're more like in parallel with what a director is.
Yes. Well, I'm so glad you bring this up because your career starts as an engineer.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, you become also a producer. Some projects you produce and you engineer, some you continue only to engineer, many you start to do both. Was there a difference in the way you approached those? Like when you became an engineer-producer, when you moved out of just the slot of being an engineer and also started producing, did you feel your space in the room change? You gave yourself permission to be more assertive? I mean, did
Absolutely, you... all of the above. My role changed very much.
Yes.
Obviously, there were some producers that I worked with. I had a list of clients who I enjoyed working with, who I got on really well with, and they were all quite different from each other in the way they operated, which is another thing about the term producer. There are many different types of producer, particularly in pop music and as against rock and roll or whatever else. Anyway, we'll get into that in a minute. As far as I was concerned, I'd sat in a room with a producer sitting next to me for many, many years, some of whom left me alone to my own devices and were very happy about that, and others interfered. And those that I continue to work with who interfered, I didn't mind at all. They always added something really interesting. However, to be sitting in both seats all of a sudden was like being set free. It was like being let out of a cage.
It
really.
was.
Oh, absolutely. It was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And the first Steve Miller album is the album that allowed me to do that for the first time.
You tell the story about how when you started working on the first Steve Miller album, you were not producing, you were engineering.
Yes.
And you became the producer midway through the project.
Yes.
Because there was really no producer until that point.
Well, I think Steve was supposed to be producing, or the band, I don't know. I was retained as the engineer and there wasn't a producer, so they were supposedly producing it. And after a period of time, I'm not terribly sure exactly how long, a matter of halfway through the project anyway, the time, allotted time to make the project, I realised that, we'd been in there a couple of weeks, I think, something like that, and we hadn't achieved anything at all. They'd just been dicking about.
Yes.
And I was bored. I mean, I just thought this is wasting my time. So I turned up one night and said, look, this is the last session I'm going to do with you because there's nothing happening. I'm wasting my time here. And there was a bit of panic. And Steve said, well, what's the problem? I said, well, the problem is, you may have noticed, we haven't actually done anything since you've been here. And there's nobody in charge. There's nobody producing. There's nobody seeking to actually achieve anything as far as I can see. So he said, well, would you do it? And I said, well, okay, fine. So that was it. From that evening on, I think we made the record in a couple of weeks or something. I can't remember. But it was pretty quick anyway.
Later on, people came to you as a producer, but you did have some relationships that started as an engineer. I mean, Steve Miller aside, I'm thinking about the Rolling Stones. You made a lot of records with the Rolling Stones as a producer, as an engineer.
As an engineer, yeah.
Later on, you made it clear that you wanted to be a producer as well, to continue to work with them. What was the process like? How did it change from engineer to producer?
Well, I never actually... Black and Blue was the only record that I was ever really supposed to be co-producing with Mick and Keith. Because whenever it was discussed, I was told to take a flying leap, basically. And in the end, the Black and Blue album, Mick and I agreed that I would co-produce it with them. And actually, it wasn't a particularly pleasant experience, and it just didn't work out. And I left. I bailed on that. That's one of the few projects I've ever bailed on. I actually walked out just because it wasn't. I was wasting my time. I wasn't enjoying myself.
Yeah, right.
And also, I wasn't really being listened to. The environment that we were working in was really odd. We were in Rotterdam, and I was in a truck in the street and they were in this hall which was completely unsuitable for the recording. I didn't even have a say in that. They picked the place because for tax reasons or something, I don't know. And I was quite a long way removed physically from where they were, which didn't help.
Yeah.
And Keith was going through a pretty unusual period at the time, which made it even more difficult, really. So we started the record in Germany, in Hamburg or some bloody where, I can't remember. And we worked for 2 weeks in a studio in Germany, and that was fantastic. Everybody was flying, really. Mick Taylor had left the band the night before we started the album. And as far as I was concerned, it was right back to where we started, except we had Nicky Hopkins on piano and Stu, but Nicky was playing. So it was like the old days from when we started out. And we actually got an immense amount done in those 2 weeks. And then by the time we got to Rotterdam, things had gone a bit sour. They were trying to replace Mick and they were looking for guitar players, so they spent half their bloody time, checking out new guitar players. I mean, it wasn't what I was there to do. They can do that at their own bloody time. Anyway, there we are.
All right, let's address the question. I thought about when I came in here, if I had been really prepared and really wanted to bring a lot of stuff with me, I was going to set one microphone over the top of us and one off to my right side and try to record the podcast using your famed drum miking technique. But I'm sure you've had to tell the story 1,000 times, but let's make it 1,001. Can you tell me how you came up with this famous technique and describe it to me?
Yes, I can. Back in the day, when we first started recording rock and roll, everything was mono for a starter. And the normal process to record drums was a couple of condenser mics. In those days, they were U47s, Neumann U47s. And we used to put one above the kit, and they're not designed for that. They're designed to be used at much more of a distance, really. Anyway, if you put one over the top of the kit, the top of the microphone is actually live as well. A lot of people are not really aware of the fact the capsule sees. It doesn't just see in an angle either side of it. It actually, the top of the mic, the capsule is live as well. So it basically captures most of the kit. And there were.
So would you have it directly over it or at an angle in front of the kit?
It would be above the snare drum, basically looking down on the whole kit.
Yes.
And then on occasion, one would use a floor tom-tom mic.
Really?
The same mic, yeah, which was slightly off to the side. It wasn't actually. It was just that side of the kit. And that became the standard thing, and I took it with me wherever I went, and then
that would be sum to mono because everything was mono at the time.
It would be sum to mono, and then on occasion you would I'd always put a snare drum mic up. I wouldn't always necessarily use it. Again, it depends on the material and the guy and how well he tunes his kit and all kinds of things. And a bass drum mic, and so there'd be 4 mics on the drums basically, and obviously they were all movable. If the guy was playing a pattern on the top toms that you weren't catching quite enough, you could lower the mic over the overhead mic, and again, if he was using the floor tom-tom stuff, you could move that, whatever, compensate.
And this was taught to you when you started. This was a technique that was already used?
This was something that it was something I picked up, watching other engineers, I guess, at IBC. So I used that as standard. Then fairly quickly, a lot of engineers started using more mics. They'd mic every drum, and they put mics underneath the snare and all that sort of thing. I always thought that was pretty odd and rather silly. And again, my principle's always been, I've been really lucky to work with really fine drummers. And the whole idea of recording, in my view, if you're fortunate enough to be working with really good talent, is to capture their sound rather than create one for them.
Yes.
And that goes for everybody, the bass player, the guitar player, the singer, whoever it is.
Your job is to capture.
My job is just because, I mean, invariably people have their own unique sound, and that very much goes with the drummer as well. I mean, drummers absolutely have their own sound, and half the reason why I'd ever book anybody would be the sound they got, never mind about their personality and their ability to play. So the really good drummers have their own sound, and they really know how to tune a kit to get what is required, which takes a whole load of stress and strain off of me. All I've got to do is capture it. I've got to reinvent the bloody wheel.
That's right.
So I maintained my simple process for years and years, and it worked really well with Charlie Watts, it worked really well with Kenny Jones, it worked well with everybody. It's really never let me down. And so I start the Led Zeppelin album, and by this time we're recording 8-track, which was very cool at the time, because previously one had always had to jump tracks together and lose a generation, all that sort of thing, in order to achieve any kind of overdub.
A lot of track sharing.
Exactly. So the drums and bass would invariably be recorded on one track.
Right.
As we went. So in the case of the Led Zeppelin session, I think I had John Paul Jones on a separate track, but I had the drums in mono. So we cut the first track, I think, and we decided, having cut it, that we'd put an acoustic guitar on it. So I stole one of the U67s off the drum kit, put it down on the floor. Bonham was on a riser in the studio. Mm-hmm. And Jimmy quickly overdubbed this acoustic guitar, and I used the 67 for it. Finished that, didn't take 10 minutes. We decided we're going to go on to the next track. I put the mic back up on the rostrum, and because I'd reassigned that microphone to another track, it was appearing in a different place in the stereo when I lifted the drum mics up as I went back in the control room, and one of the drum mics was on the extreme right. I think the other one was still in the middle. And I went, well, that sounds interesting. I wonder what would happen if I put the other one on. And there it was. And I'm sure, I've often thought that if it hadn't have been Bonham and the extraordinary massive sound that he was capable of achieving, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about it. But it did sound pretty extraordinary. So it was a fluke. It wasn't anything clever. It wasn't anything, I didn't think of it. I didn't come up with it. It just happened.
But you heard it. You recognized
it. Well, I heard it and recognized it, yeah. But I think you'd have had to be pretty stupid not to have done it.
But so, in telling the story, this may be a silly question, I don't know, but if you had a spaced pair of mics accidentally or whatever over the kit, and you had pulled those up in stereo, is it possible you would have heard, 2 overheads, one panned left and one panned right? You would have said, oh, that sounds pretty good too. Or is there something about this strange relationship between the mics?
There is definitely something about the particular thing, and the secret to it is quite simply that both mics are equidistant from the snare drum, mm-hmm. and they're both looking at the snare drum. Mm-hmm. So the tom-tom mic isn't over the top of a tom-tom pointing down. Right. It's aimed from the side at the snare drum.
Right.
And it works. Again, I would never have thought of that, because I'm not that clever. It just happened.
You whispered in my ear once that the other secret or fundamental principle of it to you is that they really should be 67s.
Yes, completely correct. 67s are easily the best in my view, or you can use 247s. Yeah. But other than that, to be honest with you, I don't think I've ever tried it with anything else. So I'm sure there are exceptions to that. I know some people use 414s mm-hmm. and the AKG mic. Yeah. I'm sure there are all kinds of different mics you could use, but I'm familiar with the capsules on those microphones right. and what they see. And so it works for me, but I'm sure there's loads of other ways of doing it.
There's all kinds of tutorials on the internet, pictures of...
Nonsense.
Tape measures and...
Yeah, it's an absolute drivel. I don't know any of these people. They've never met me. They don't know me. They're welcome to experiment and do whatever they want and say whatever they want, but I don't know about any of it. I think there's one thing online where I went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They've got an engineering school there, which I visited, and I actually showed the kids with a drum kit and some mics, and one of them was filming it. I had no idea, in fact, but that's up online. So that's
correct.
That's correct. Yes.
But interestingly, when people, I've seen it in sessions, and so I'm sure many people see this, where somebody, an artist or a producer, will walk in and say to the engineer, I want the Glyn Johns drum sound, but whether or not they're doing it, unless you're doing it, it's not the Glyn Johns drum sound, but everybody has an idea of what that means, and it has actually become so prevalent that all you have to say is Glyn Johns, and people say, oh, I know what you're talking about. I think I know what you mean, Right. It's become
Well,
That's kind of a standard.
I had no idea that was the case, and if so, that's pretty fantastic. I mean, that's amazing for me to hear. We're back to the principle of capturing the sound that the musician is giving you. Now, nowadays, with the popular music of today, that isn't always what's required, and so perhaps it's not so easy for people to apply my technique. It all depends. It's horses for courses, isn't it? It depends what you're up to. I think my method gives you space, and equally, it gives you an audio dynamic that's far greater than if you mic something closely. It's difficult to explain, really. So I won't.
But it also seems to really require the right room. I mean, you need a space to record drums in.
Of course, that goes with anything.
Yes.
That goes with anything you're recording. It doesn't matter what it is. The acoustic space around that area has to either contain the sound enough, or you don't want to hear any other acoustic, or some people actually do put it in a room that has its own acoustic, and they like that, and there was a period of time when Hidley was building studios where they'd create a dead end of the studio that was so dead you couldn't fart in it.
Yes.
And the other end was so live it was just absurd. So they took the whole thing to
an extreme.
To total extremes. And again, that was what was required at that moment in time, because people were exploring and experimenting and trying to change the sound of what was going on, and they were very successful. I mean, Phil Collins is a classic example of that. I can't remember the name of the record now, but you know the one I mean.
Yeah.
With Hugh, what's his face?
Pagham.
Hugh Pagham. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. That's the only time I've ever heard it used to any really good effect, to be honest with you. But it's horses for courses. It's like I say.
Oh, you're talking about the big gated reverb on the toms and that whole sound.
Just that massive, sort of rather unnatural drum sound.
Unnatural, well, exactly.
Extremely unnatural, but it created a whole other deal. Listen, as an engineer, as you very well know, you're painting a picture in sound, which is being perceived by another human brain, and they will have their own perception of what that picture is. It won't necessarily be the same as yours. It's very interesting. It's a fascinating topic, something about which I have to say I very rarely think or talk, but it is a fascinating topic. And even now, with the way records are made, one instrument at a time, in a very dead environment, invariably, they are still a picture being painted, and it's still creating a mental picture for the listener, whatever that might be. I'd like to think that in my day, and me and several others, we had a slightly bigger palette, if you like, with which to work. Or maybe the canvas was different, I don't know. Right. The canvas was certainly different.
Well, it's interesting, right? On the one hand, you had a bigger palette, and on the other hand, you had a more fixed palette, in that it actually required that it was played live by people in the room at the same time. So that's actually quite finite in that way.
No, you're absolutely correct. That where the way my whole process has worked is, how to put it really, it's a combination of my approach to, like I said already, my approach to capturing the sound of the individual musicians, but also by having as many of the parts of whatever the end product's going to be being played at once.
Yes.
So that they react off each other subliminally. I'm not talking about anything hair-raising, but in a rhythm section, never mind about anything else, within that rhythm section, whether they know it or not, each guy is subliminally reacting to what he's hearing the others doing and adjusting and invariably complimenting, and then what he does will affect the others, and so it goes on. The magic of that is my biggest buzz in a recording studio, is watching something start as an idea, somebody playing a song on a guitar or a piano or whatever it is, and then the exploration of how you go about presenting that song, the instrumentation, who plays what, when and where. You get the arrangement, you finally get the arrangement done and it all seems to work. And now the next thing is to actually get the performance of it that has that extra little bit of magic, which doesn't necessarily come quickly. It might come immediately.
Yes.
And in fact, the longer you go on, as you again will know, invariably a lot is lost because you either disappearing up your own backside or you don't have that adrenaline rush that you were getting at the beginning when you were first exploring the thing. So that is something that's very, very, I treasure all the hours that I had that going on in front of me. And I appreciate to a degree, but I don't see how that can ever be achieved in the way most people record now.
Right. Well, and in a way, it does speak to this thing I tell you that people, when you walk into a session and a producer says, I want the Glyn Johns drum sound, what they may not understand is that if we're going to do drums alone and then layer everything, it doesn't really matter where you place the mics because some of that's happening magically in the room.
Let's just talk about that. I'll give you an example of what I'm trying to say. I did an album with Ryan Adams in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And Jeremy Stacey was the drummer. Brilliant, brilliant drummer. So we finished the album, we had a great time, and the following day, he was starting another album. Can't remember who the artist was, doesn't matter, but some contemporary artist, English. Uh-huh. And he invited me to pop by. I was coming by to pick something up. Yeah. So I stuck my nose around the door, and in the control room there were 2 engineers and a producer, and the room was full of drums. I've never seen so many drums in one place in my life. And they'd been there for several hours, and they were trying to work out what his kit should be made of. And they'd been doing this for some time. Okay, good luck to them. If that's what they want, fine. I've heard stories about people taking 2 or 3 days to get a drum sound.
Bass drum sound for a day.
Yeah. I'm sorry, it's not that important. I'm sorry, it isn't. It is not that important. It couldn't possibly be that important. 1, 2. I would never dream of getting a drum sound or listening to the drums until he's playing the song with everyone else. Because he's going to be playing them differently than if he's sitting there and somebody's saying, can you hit your snare drum, can you hit your bass drum? Whatever. He's not going to play it the same. It's going to be entirely different sounds you're going to get. So as far as I'm concerned, you're wasting your time completely. Hear him play the song, and then you can get the sound. And fortunately, because I'm so lazy, my technique, you lift up 3 faders and you work on it from there. And he and I might work together on I might move my microphone slightly, or we might talk about what part of the kit he's using and how he's using it, or whatever else. All right, but there might be no comment at all, and he'll come in and have a playback, and he might say, I think I might change that cymbal, or I don't think that's quite working, or maybe I should use a different top tom, or whatever. That's fine, Or you might even say, actually, the bass drum sound isn't quite what it should be. Maybe we should try the Ludwig or the whatever else. But that's as far as it goes. Again, it's playing a song that you're bloody going to be playing against what everything else is doing.
Yes.
And if you get a drum sound on its own, it could sound amazing on its own, but you add 4 or 5 other instruments, and of course it's not going to sound the same.
Well, the same maybe is true of not only the drum sound, but all of the sounds. You want to hear the song that you're going to be recording before you decide how you want to record it.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of choices that you make. They sound so quaint compared to the kinds of choices that people think about and talk about. Honestly, they do, To say, well, what I like to do is hear a band playing a song and then I decide how I want it to sound. It sounds like, oh, that's so charming. Yeah, exactly. That's so charming. And so what do you think now when you see the way records are made? I mean, did you get into Pro Tools? Did you ever get into working on the computer?
No. I've had to use it on occasion over the years. It's fine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound as good as tape.
Yeah.
And that's the beginning and the end of it. So if I'm put in a situation where I have to use it, then I will.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't choose it out of choice. If I had my druthers now, I'd work 16 track.
Yeah.
with a Dolby system. Does me.
If somebody called you tomorrow and said, I've discovered a really talented young artist who I think you would be perfect to go in and record and produce, at this stage in your life and where you know, would that sound exciting to you? Would you?
Good Lord, yes. Are you kidding? No, I'm much happier in the studio than I am anywhere else. I'm going nuts not being in the studio. I just went and made an album in Kentucky.
Really?
In Louisville, with a blues band, the son of which is a son of a dear friend of mine, is the singer in it. And they're really good.
Yeah.
And I did it. I couldn't wait to get there. I had an absolute blast. Did it for nothing. It was, I don't want. There wouldn't be. They couldn't have afforded to pay me. But I can't wait to get back in with anybody. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's still who you are. It's not only what you do, but it's who you are.
It's absolutely. It's fun.
Yes.
I absolutely love it and still do. I do find it incredibly difficult to find anybody I want to work with. One, I haven't been offered an artist by a record label for years.
Well, that may be because record labels don't play the same role, I think, that they did. Record labels.
Well, maybe not. But to the extent that they do, they would never dream of asking me. But I've told them all to sod off anyway, mostly many years ago when things started changing and there were kids taking over A&R, which is no problem at all. You've got to hand over to younger people. That's completely correct. But I don't really like being told how to make a record by
a 27-year-old.
Well, by somebody younger than that even. Or I never like being told how to make a record by anybody. It wouldn't matter how old they were. So you can start with that. I was unbelievably fortunate to be born when I was and to enter the business when I did, because I was spot rotten really against what preceded and what followed.
Yes. It was a sweet spot in the...
It was a very sweet spot because we were just left alone to get on with it, and it worked. It worked for everybody. It's awful now, and has been for so long. The way that the creative process has been manipulated by business, and that's always been the case to a degree, but not to the same extent. By that I mean that the downfall to me began many years ago when radio became corporatized to the extent that it did in the United States. And so there'd be one or two people in the bowels of some building programming 40, 50 stations, whatever it may be more.
All over the country, yes.
Yeah, all over the country. And it was worked out on some sort of formula, nothing to do with the DJ and his taste or his personality or anything else. And all of a sudden we were all being told, no, you can't do that. It doesn't fit in this box, So
doesn't test well.
No. It's just... Yeah. And so how can that maintain any kind of creative situation? I presume, and I don't know because I don't follow it so much now, I presume that's changing now because people have their own independent sources of reaching out to the listener online and one thing and another, so they can create stuff without some other bugger that they've never met before telling them what they should be or shouldn't be doing.
I think you can, but I also think that one thing that's lost along the way, and it probably won't come back, is the idea that you could ever really make a record that everybody would know. You know what I mean? The idea that a Beatles or a Michael Jackson or a Led Zeppelin or a band that everybody who likes a certain kind of music, they've all heard that. It becomes a cultural reference.
Yes.
I think it has become so kind of divided up into these little bits that, yes, you can find your audience, but I think the days of having a hit that everybody in America could hum along to.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I could look at the top 50 now, I wouldn't know anybody in it, almost certainly. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. It's weird, isn't it? Very weird.
It's just different. I mean, it's just changed. And as much as I'm not so old school. I'm old enough that I've seen it change, but I also understand, as you do, that it's meant to change. It's always going to change. It just seems like it changed. The technology and the popular culture and the business all changed for a moment, and this is the moment that really was your moment in which it created something really great. There was a lot of great culture and music that came out of it.
And there are lots of different theories. none of which could be proven one way or the other, as to why it happened when it did and all that. And I haven't got a clue really.
I was, I guess, a bit curious to know how straight you were as a person and are as a person, because the music that you're associated with was so fueled by and later on romanticized by being kind of informed by drugs and all of this craziness, and you throughout the whole thing really didn't get into any of that.
I really didn't. No, I've never touched anything. I won't take an aspirin unless I'm in agony. No, I'm a funny old bugger. I don't know. I don't really know why. It was very easy for me to remain on the outside of that. Everyone says, I don't know how on earth you could have done it, and da-da-da. Wasn't a problem at all. A lot of what was going on around me by those who were under the influence of whatever drug it was, or alcohol, or whatever else, were invariably behaving in a way that I had absolutely no connection with whatsoever. So it didn't appeal to me. One, two, because I was an engineer for most of that period of time, and even when I became I started producing, I was engineering. You can't really you have to be completely compos mentis.
Yes.
To do a technical job like that. It's not that technical, it's common sense, but you still have to be completely on the ball, really. And because I suppose to a certain degree I'm a bit of a perfectionist, I suppose I'd have to be, otherwise I wouldn't be sitting where I am now. And again, you have to have your marbles about you when you're that sort of person, I guess. It was quite interesting. A lot of the time when I was working with people, when I was engineering and I wasn't in charge of the session, I was just the engineer, I had to sit through and witness all kinds of nonsense and waste huge amounts of time on the one hand, and on the other, I think there were certainly occasions when the particular individual perhaps benefited to a degree from being put in another mental place by a drug because it made them more relaxed, or it took them out of being frightened or whatever. Because, I mean, if you consider any artist going in a studio to make an album, in those days in particular, your life was on the line each time, your career was on the line each time you went in. And
in the sense that somebody's paying for it, you...
Well, you either are seeking success or you've had it and you want to continue it, and you're going to be judged by everybody from your grandmother to your biggest fan by what you're doing, and that can make you incredibly insecure. I mean, it's normal, I guess.
Yes.
And there were others that didn't, if they all thought they were marvellous anyway. It didn't make any difference. But there were certainly individuals who felt the pressure of the recording. It is like being under a microscope being recorded. It's as you again know. It's a whole nother ball game, and it's something you get used to.
Yes.
But again, if it's your name on the cover, and you're not that confident a person to begin with,
yes,
there certainly is where drugs probably helped. But as soon as I was in the chair and was able to call the shots as to what went on and how in the environment that we were working in, I wouldn't work with anybody who was using anything.
You ran a very clean session.
Yeah, and it to a large extent that paid off, I think. Everybody was very respectful of most people. The Eagles left me in the end without any question because I wouldn't let them.
You think that's what you say without any question? It was they wanted to get high and drink.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure all of them were like that, but certainly a couple of them. And they really resented the fact that I wouldn't allow them to get high on the one hand, and I think they probably resented the fact that I was in a position to say that or call the shots. As time went by, they got more confident and they became more self-contained in their own thing, and they didn't need me. In fact, they, like a lot of acts, they go on and they. It's a good job they did, because the records they made after they left me were phenomenal and hugely successful. So, although I helped establish them to begin with, what they became was very much down to them, and as a result of them having their own way and doing what they wanted to do.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's an interesting job, that of production, and I think if it's almost a joke if you ask 10 producers what a producer does, you get 12 answers about what it is. But it does seem, especially when you take something like producing a band where they've already, chances are, established a rapport among themselves, they have a point of view, they think they know who they are.
Yes.
For one individual to enter that fray and tell them, well, you know, I think that we want to focus on this, or that it's really a brutally exposed job for a producer also, and I think every producer seems to have their own style and way. Sometimes it's through strength, sometimes it's through compassion, a bit of both. You know what I'm saying? Like, there are different ways to...
I think bands are particularly difficult because there are usually 4 or 5 individual personalities, and then certainly not all going to be the same. And there's invariably going to be one guy who's a problem, or maybe more. The key... I mean, I don't know where to begin here. I'd like to think that, well, first of all, in order for me to get involved with anybody, I have to respect what they're up to and really appreciate it.
Yes. So you're a fan. You started as a kind of a fan.
You start out by being impressed with what they're doing and excited by what they're doing, and therefore you feel like you might be able to contribute in some way to what's going on. Different people, as you again know very well, different people have different requirements. Some of the acts I've worked with have just really... I've been incredibly fortunate to be in the room, you know, and I've... Thank you, God.
Yeah.
This is just amazing. And all I've done is record it. Or provided an environment in which has allowed them to perform in the manner that they have, or whatever.
But that's not a small thing, providing an environment.
No, it's not a small thing, but basically we've touched on this earlier. Yes. A producer's role could vary dramatically between one project and another, and within one project.
Yes.
Depending on who got out of bed, which side, what day, etc., etc. So I've worked with all kinds of artists, literally. I mean, I've done how many records I've made, but lots. And no two situations are the same. You know, obviously you learn from putting your foot in someone's mouth at the wrong time or whatever. But as far as I'm concerned, any idea that I've ever had, that I've ever presented to an artist about the manner in which a song should be performed, or the arrangement, or the tempo, or the whatever, the key, whatever it is, has always been a suggestion. It's not this is the way you're going to do it.
Right.
And the reason for that is, quite obviously, it isn't my record, it's theirs. And secondly, there's absolutely no point in trying to get someone to perform in a way that they don't believe in. You're wasting your time. They've got to... All I ask is they'll try the idea out. And if they don't like it, or it doesn't sit well, forget about it. It's just a silly idea. It's just one idea.
Yeah.
Forget about it, move on. Now, I'd like to think that I've always been like that. I'm pretty sure that isn't true. But that was always... That's when I look back on how marvellous I am. That's what I think. But I'm sure there are occasions when I was quite... I wasn't that.
Well, you know, you say this thing, first of all, it's their record, you say. On the other hand, you know, you say this thing in your book I like, which is that if an album is successful, it's the band's, it's because of the band, and if it's a failure, it's because of the producer.
Yes.
So you know, you have something riding on the success of a record at any given time also.
I do, but my job is to provide a service to the artist, not to the record label even, although, of course, that one has to pay allegiance to the fact that it's their business and they're paying for it, so you don't want them to lose money.
Yes.
But my primary interest is for the artist to walk out at the end of the experience feeling really proud of what they've done and confident about what they've done, and to move on to the next stage.
I wonder if you, in the records that you've made in recent years, have come up against what I see a lot, which is that record labels are not paying for records, that artists are paying for them, or third parties are paying for them, and then licensing or finding a way to distribute them or whatever. And it does change the role of the producer to an extent, because it becomes less about delivering a product that's being paid for to somebody, and more about, like, I find myself often in the little records that I make working for the artist, in the sense that the artist is paying for it. It's much harder to set those limits sometimes? Like, you ultimately, as a producer, you are working for the label. You have to deliver an album to the label.
Yeah, I've never really seen it like that. Of course, to a degree, I've always respected that.
Yeah.
But my primary feeling is to the artist.
Yes.
And on certain occasions, I protected the artist against the label.
Yes.
Because I can see that they were being taken advantage of, or they're being pushed into an area that they weren't comfortable with,
yes.
or all kinds of reasons. So, what tends to happen in our business is that people within the business
yes.
forget the fact that without the artist, they wouldn't have a job. And that's very easy to do if you're some high and mighty guy who thinks you're ruling the world and your taste is brilliant and
yes.
Whatever else. But that's the reality of it. Without that guy or girl or
yes.
group of people, you wouldn't have a job at all.
Yes. You started out as a singer. You wanted to be a singer.
Yeah. Yes. Rather foolish endeavour.
Why do you say foolish? I mean, you convinced the label to invest in you, put some singles out.
Yeah, that's true, I suppose. Yeah. But I'm sure if that came about because I was working in a recording studio, I had a foot in the door kind of thing. So it was a bit easier than if I was a plumber's mate and sending my demo in,
So is that part of the reason? Is that a reason that once you had a career established, I mean, you never thought to go back and sing?
Oh, good Lord, no. No, I learned very quickly that it wasn't for me. I never had. I was interested in the job, taking the job initially when I left school at this recording studio because it was fascinating and it interested me. But I never considered that I'd become an engineer or whatever
right.
else. As far as I was concerned, I was getting my foot in the door to try and get myself discovered as a singer. And when I did get discovered as a singer, and I felt I'd gone as far as I could as an engineer, I was the senior engineer at the studio by this time, and it didn't, the idea of doing that for the rest of my life didn't appeal at all. There was no such thing as a freelance engineer, it didn't exist. So, and there were these barriers to go anywhere. I might have ended up managing a studio. Didn't appeal to me at all. So off I went, made a record, turned professional as a singer, supposedly. However, in order to be considered a professional singer, you have to be retained and paid to sing, which didn't quite work out. So I'm glad I did it. I don't regret any of it, but I had evidently created a demand for my services as an engineer
yes.
prior to this, which, again, was very fortunate. And it was suggested that I become freelance, which I did.
But, when you say it's quite exposing, it's like being kind of under a microscope to be an artist, to be a singer, to be recorded. I wonder if having that little experience early on of knowing what it's like yourself to stand in front of the microphone.
I'm sure that's true, subliminally, yes. I'd never considered that, but of course that's true, yeah. But, the difference is, I wasn't the self-contained item that I ended up dealing with. I was singing other people's songs, basically.
I see.
So when I'm talking about an artist's career of the people that I've worked with,
yes.
they've invariably, it's been the whole package. It's been the material they write, the manner in which they progress as a writer, whether their whole creative package is being represented on the album.
Right.
In those days, it was on the album you were making.
Yeah.
And it was doing them justice.
And there was a bigger vision.
Well, yeah. I mean, you didn't ever necessarily discuss that, but again, subliminally, that was what was going on in my book anyway.
Yeah.
And of course, those of who were straight enough to see the wall on the other side of the room would probably agree.
Right. Do you think, you talk about being an engineer and having to watch so much go down, to all those early days where you had to sort of keep your mouth shut and just let things happen. Do you think that having the experience of having to stay quiet when maybe you did have an idea that you wanted to say, is it valuable to learn when to be silent and when to speak up?
Absolutely. Of course it is, in life.
Yes.
Never mind about on a recording session.
Yes.
Just start with your mum and dad.
Know when to just keep your head down.
Or your children. I mean,
yes.
whatever. Yeah, absolutely.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, it was really I was so lucky to have the experiences that I did as an engineer, working in the studios the studio when I was employed.
Yes.
The variety of stuff that came through there was, well, it was 360 degrees. It could be absolutely any type of music with any type of individual from all over the world. And, you know, did film music, did jingles, we did popular music of the day, we did classical music, we did. So you were constantly being thrown into an environment, a different environment with different types of people, different intellects, different education, different methods of working. So I saw a lot going on sitting in my chair, you know, without ever doing anything or saying anything. And it was the best education I could have had easily. And then fortunately, when I went on to become freelance engineer, I had a list of clients who were quite varied. And I watched that whole process of when the young started taking control more of what was going on, which was very interesting.
I'm sure.
And as a result, I have been so fortunate to work with people like The Who, for example, at the very beginning, when in the era prior to that, the artist was being manipulated always, to their benefit very often, by a producer, by an A&R man who'd selected the song and had this vision of what the arrangement should be. And of course, depending on how successful the artist was, they'd have an opinion, and they'd say, no, I don't want to sing that, or I want it to be done with an orchestra, not with three banjos and whatever. But the A&R man very much had the vision and was responsible for the success. And all of a sudden, you had a bunch of kids coming along who were writing their own material and had a very clear idea about what they wanted to be, do, sound like. And the producer's role was to zip it and be thankful that you were in the room, which I was to a large degree.
And facilitate in some way.
And facilitate, no, absolutely. And there were a lot of really good guys. Denny Cordell being a classic example, who was a really successful producer in the late 60s, early 70s, I guess it would have been. Denny couldn't whistle. I mean, he couldn't sing a tune. I never saw him come up with an arrangement idea, but he had a fantastic vibe about him, and he knew sound. He would be quite involved with the sound I was getting always, and critical of it, and, you know, I did whatever he wanted, of course. And could judge feel as well as anybody I've ever met, you know. So he brought a whole other thing, and then there were other producers who made pop records, like Mickey Most, who was a song picker. That's what he was.
He could hear a song.
He could hear a song, and he'd either put it with somebody that he was producing, or he'd select from the barrel of songs they came in with, and he'd know just how to make it a hit. Yeah. I mean, I didn't know him terribly well. Completely the other end of the bloody scale to me. Unbelievably successful. Ridiculously successful. He hardly ever had a miss. I did a session for him once, and he read the paper. You know, he didn't. I don't really know why he turned up, to be honest. He didn't contribute anything to the session. As far as he was concerned, I guess he'd done his job. He'd done his job already. Anyway, there we are. Well, so but that's the thing about so many different types of producers.
That's exactly
back to
right.
that again.
That's exactly. But it's also interesting to hear you talk about that early experience where you came into contact with so many different types of people, and, you know, different intellect, different, you know, all different types of, because it appears to me, when you look at the sort of, especially the British rock and roll, early kind of rock and roll scene, it was kind of a small community. Everybody sort of knew each other, you know? Yeah.
And a lot of us came from within a very small area, in fact, which is pretty strange. I mean, there were the invaders from Newcastle and Liverpool. Yes. The Animals came from Newcastle, and from Manchester, the Hollies came from Manchester. But everybody knew everyone else. It was quite small, exactly right. And they all, in those days, there were package tours where, I don't know, 5 or 6 artists would appear on the same bill. Right. And they do a cinema tour of the UK, and so everybody got to know each other that way. You know? Yeah.
I know that LA was its own closed circuit of people, and New York also. There were, you know, obviously units of musicians that knew each other, played on each other's records. But I sort of get the sense that the British scene was even maybe more like a familiar, smaller scene. Maybe that's my vision of it, but...
Well, since I wasn't in America until 1967 or 8, I can't remember exactly which, I can't really comment, but it stands to reason, America being the size it is, that LA and New York, would be and Nashville, you had those three, and they had their own little scenes going, and any one of them would have been the equivalent of what was going on in London, because it was so easy for kids to come down from London.
That's true. Have you developed a sense, is there a physical reaction that you've had at certain times of all of the records that you've made when you hear something and you say, this one is really special?
While I was doing them, you mean? Oh, Christ, yeah. Absolutely. Can you imagine... Okay, all right, how long have you got? Won't Get Fooled Again. I remember as clear as I'm sitting here now, sitting in I recorded that at Mick Jagger's house in the country, a house called Stargroves, and we had the Stones truck parked outside, so I wasn't even in the room. I had a camera with a very little black and white screen. But I remember sitting in the truck with them. They played live to that. I played in the synthesizer track, which had already...
Which was it from the demo, or it was from...
It was from Pete's demo, And they actually played to that, which in itself was pretty extraordinary to do, particularly with... It's not exactly Keith Moon playing the drums.
Click tracks were not quite so common back then.
Well, I've never used a click track in my life, and although you could deem that to... Well, it was a groove they had to sit with, but it wasn't a click. But I can remember sitting in the truck, having my hair parted by that. The first Led Zeppelin album, I can remember having my hair parted by most of the stuff on that. I could go on, Take It Easy with the Eagles. I remember sitting there and thinking, okay, this is going to be huge. All Day and All of the Night with the Kinks. I can remember just being totally blown away by that. Never heard anything like it.
Yeah.
It was really exciting. It's difficult for anyone else to imagine that because it's been around for 50 years.
You're born hearing it.
But at the time, it was completely unusual.
Yeah. So in a sense, you're sort of like, you're the first audience. You are the first audience. You sort of, you have the chance to experience it the way an audience will hear it 3 months later, but you're hearing it first.
Yes.
You think to yourself, God, this is going to be huge. I mean, do you think that success is an indicator of if something is great?
No, not at all. And of course, I haven't always been right. In fact, I've cut stuff that I thought was okay and was fine, and it went to number one, and I had no idea why. I've got a clue. So I'm very happy that it did, for the artists in particular. Marvellous, but I got it wrong, really. And also, I've passed on acts that went on to be marvellous, and I missed the point at the time, or I was too busy, whatever, I don't know.
Right.
Lots of reasons. And there are some multi-million selling acts that I've passed on that I don't regret at all. Absolutely. Because I wouldn't have got on with them, and I wouldn't have done a good job.
Yes.
And so it wouldn't have been any good for them, and it certainly wouldn't have been any good for me either. You know. I think my biggest rule... There are two rules that I've applied to myself over the years, and one is never do anything for the money.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the biggest mistake anybody can make in our business. You have to be completely convinced that you can be of use to the thing and worth whatever they're paying you, basically. And the other thing, as a producer, is to avoid the media completely.
What do you mean?
If you're at the beginning of your career, or even perhaps if you're at the peak of it, the media. First of all, I've never deemed it necessary to be read about by the general public, because they're not going to employ me one way or the other. And I was fortunate enough to have enough interested artists who wanted to work with me just through the network of the industry. So it's very easy for me to sit here and say what I'm saying. But when I was a kid and I first got the job at IBC, I sat and watched for 2 years while I was training. I watched what was going on and how it all worked, because I didn't know. I was as green as grass when I walked in the door. And one of the things I very quickly learned was that people use the media in order to get publicity, and they do use them. I mean, they milk them basically.
Sure.
And then the media, once you become successful, the media tend to get bored with the status quo. And so the only thing that the media can do to make things interesting and their readers interested in what they're writing is to be negative. And invariably, they'll seek to be negative about somebody who is successful rather than positive. Or they'll be positive for a while, and then it usually turns around on itself. And particularly if journalists in my day were being used to help promote somebody, and eventually they get pissed off with it, and they go, well, I know how I'll get a headline here, and the headline won't be "This guy's marvellous." They've already read that. It'll be "This guy's a paedophile," or whatever it is.
Whatever it is.
So, again, fortunately, I never had to use the media at all. The only time I've ever had PR on my account was when I published a book, and the only reason for that was because if we didn't let people know it existed,
they wouldn't buy it.
They wouldn't buy it. Or more to the point, they wouldn't read it. So, I'm absolutely convinced that because I kept my head down for nearly my entire life, my career lasted as long as it did, and I was able to continue being very busy for a long time. I don't know, we'll never know if that's the case or not, if that's true, but that's what I feel anyway. It certainly didn't do me any harm.
Sure, no, clearly not. I don't see how you could have been, in the busy period of your career, I don't see how you could have been busier. It seems to me you were...
No, I never stopped working,
Your son Ethan is in the business. He's a successful producer, songwriter. He came of age at a time when there was also a business to get into and to break into.
Yes.
But I wonder if you look at people getting into the business today, and if you have any sense of what they're getting themselves into, if you would encourage people to try for a life in recorded music today.
I would never discourage anybody at all if they really have a passion for it, because that's all you need. The most important thing in life is that you're happy, isn't it? Obviously, one wants a roof over your head and food on the table, but if you really, really have a passion for it, then absolutely go for it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting, actually. When my son Ethan left school, he'd been fiddling around, playing drums and guitar and one thing and another, and he was pretty good.
Yeah.
And he said he wanted to be a musician, and that freaked me out completely, because I did feel that probably wasn't a route for him to go if he wanted to have the roof over his head and food on the table. So I suggested that he learn engineering and have that as a feather in his cap. Because he was able to do that, it would also mean he would be coming in contact with other musicians all the time, and it wouldn't prevent him from playing or being a musician, but he would actually have a job which earned him a reasonable living in the interim.
Yes.
And he could make of that whatever he wanted, and which of course he did. And as it turns out, it worked out remarkably well.
Yes.
He gets to play on a lot of the records that he produces now. He makes he makes one album a year himself.
Yes.
And there are occasions where he just goes and produces. And I think having all those strings to his bow are really wonderful.
Yes.
And he's very satisfied with his lot.
And I suppose it was probably a little crazy for your family when you chose a career in music. So
they thought I'd gone to the moon. I mean, they had no idea what I was getting involved with. But interestingly, unbelievably, my father, when I told my father that I was going to go and try and get this job at a recording studio, which he knew nothing about at all, he just said, if that's what you want to do, go and do it. I mean, I was amazed. My jaw dropped to the floor because I thought he'd just say, forget about it, you've got to go and do something. I think he was probably grateful that I got a job at all. More than likely, yeah.
Well, I think a lot of people are grateful that you got a job at all, because if you hadn't gotten that job, we wouldn't have these records.
Bless your heart.
Glyn Johns, is there anything we should talk about before we wrap this up?
Well, I don't think so. I think we've covered quite a lot here. I don't know.
I guess, you know what I should ask you, just for personal reasons? Can you tell me your memory of the first Ben Sidran record?
No, I remember that very well. I remember having the meeting with the guy at Capitol trying to persuade him to sign Ben.
Yes.
In fact, very clearly. It was a great time. I'm incredibly fond of your dad and your mum, who's she's so beautiful. She never looks any different. She takes some pill.
No,
I'm
convinced that at some point in the late 60s, early 70s, they did go to the crossroads.
Sold
and
their souls.
they stood there and they made the deal.
He was the most unlikely character to be involved with Steve Miller, I always thought. I mean, they were friends. And obviously Steve admired your dad's ability to play. And what he did do on the Miller records was marvellous. I mean, he fit really well. But it wasn't really his cup of tea, if the truth are known at all. So it was a rather strange thing. That shortly thereafter, he moved to England and did the university degree, the Dr. Jazz thing. And I probably saw more of him or as much of him then as at any time, because he was in Sussex, Brighton, and I was up the other end of the county. I have a huge respect for your dad. I think it's brilliant what he's done. He's never sat still, your father. He's obviously... God knows what would have happened if he'd have gone into education, I think.
Well, I know. I mean, when you say that you remember convincing Capitol to sign him, I think, imagine if that hadn't happened. Where would we be today?
I've no idea. Well, he'd have got to deal with somewhere else, I'm sure. But it's very interesting that he has gone on to become the force that he has in the genre of music that he's... And he's quite happy. I mean, he had that TV show for years. Amazing. I mean... That was years ago too. I mean, really, absolutely brilliant. He just doesn't sit still.
You say this thing about how he was so unlikely in the Steve Miller Band. I asked him this question earlier this year because I interviewed him for his birthday this year, and I asked him, to the extent that he wants to talk about it on the record, how he feels about being followed around by this very short period in his life when he was in the Steve Miller Band. Later on he went back and he worked with Steve in the 80s, and so they had a kind of a re-encounter. But what it's like to do so many things and kind of be followed around by one or two major things that don't necessarily represent
who you are.
Yeah,
no, exactly.
I think it happens to a lot of people.
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah, like my bloody drum miking.
Exactly. Well, Glyn, thank you for telling me about the drum miking and so much more.
It's entirely my pleasure.
There he was, my friends, the great Glyn Johns. We really got somewhere at the end, and the journey was pretty good, too. Happy holidays to you all. I'll be back again next year with a whole lot of deep dives. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.